The community center hall was packed, buzzing with the low hum of excited chatter and the distinct smell of too many people crowded into one room. It was the biggest night of the year for the local music students, the annual piano showcase. This wasn't just a school concert, it was the kind of event where the judges sat in the front row with sharp pencils and serious faces, ready to mark down every wrong note. The air was thick with tension and the smell of expensive perfume and hairspray. Parents were fixing their children's bow ties and smoothing out dresses, whispering last-minute advice about posture and hand position. In the very front of the room, sat a group of students who everyone knew were the stars. They went to the fancy conservatory across town. You could tell just by looking at them. They sat with their backs straight, their clothes perfectly pressed, and their sheet music organized in neat, glossy black folders. They were talking loudly about Rachmaninoff and Liszt, dropping names of composers that sounded fancy and difficult. They looked like they owned the place. The parents around them nodded with respect, obviously impressed by the confidence these kids showed. Everyone expected the trophy to go to one of them. It seemed like a done deal. Sitting much further back, near the heavy double doors that led to the lobby, was a young girl named Maya. She was 13 years old, though she looked smaller sitting in the large, plastic chair. She was wearing a simple dress that looked like it might have been an older cousin's. The color was a bit faded, and it didn't have the shiny, new look that the other girls' dresses had. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, not the fancy updos styled with glitter that were popular in the front rows. Maya was clutching a folder of sheet music to her chest. The folder was old. The corners were bent and frayed, and it had been taped back together in more than one place. To the people walking by, she looked like she was just there to watch, maybe waiting for an older brother or sister to finish playing. A few times, someone asked her, "Are you here for the junior recital?" assuming she was too young or too unimportant to be in the main show. Maya would just shake her head politely and look down at her shoes. The truth was, Maya was terrified. She looked around the room and felt completely out of place. The other students seemed to shine with confidence. They had expensive lessons and pianos that cost more than cars. Maya had a beat-up upright piano at home that her dad had found second-hand. She practiced in a small living room while her mom cooked dinner in the next room. She didn't have a fancy teacher with a degree from a famous university. She just had a love for music and a lot of stubborn determination. As the time for the recital to start drew closer, the noise in the hall died down. The organizer, a man with a microphone and a list of names, walked onto the stage. He tapped the mic, causing a screech of feedback that made everyone flinch. "Welcome, everyone," he said, his voice echoing off the walls. "We have a wonderful program for you tonight. Our students have worked very hard." He began reading the rules, reminding people to turn off their cell phones and to please wait until the end of a piece to clap. Maya's heart pounded against her ribs. She felt small in the vast sea of people. She looked at the front of the room where the conservatory students sat. They were flipping through their music casually, not nervous at all. One of them, a boy in a sharp suit, was laughing at a joke his friend made. Maya wondered if she even belonged here. Maybe it was a mistake to sign up. The first few performers were exactly what everyone expected. They walked up to the stage, adjusted their stools, and played difficult pieces with perfect precision. They hit every note, their fingers flying fast and strong. The audience clapped politely. "Very nice," she heard a woman behind her whisper. "So technical." But Maya noticed something. While the playing was perfect, it felt a little cold. It was like watching a machine do a job. There was no feeling in it, just skill. The room began to feel a bit restless. It happens at every long recital. People started checking their watches. Some parents were quietly opening crinkly wrappers of snacks for their younger children. The excitement of the beginning was wearing off, replaced by a kind of polite endurance. Everyone was waiting for the big names to play at the end. Then, the organizer on stage looked down at his list. He paused, looking confused for a moment, as if he didn't recognize the name. He cleared his throat. "Up next," he announced, his voice lacking the enthusiasm he had for the previous students, "we have Maya, playing an arrangement of The River Flows in You." There was a ripple of quiet murmurs in the crowd. It wasn't a classical sonata. It wasn't a complex concerto. It was a popular piece, one that many students played early on. It wasn't considered serious music for a competition like this. The judges in the front row leaned back in their chairs, picking up their pens to write some notes. They expected a simple, beginner performance. They thought this would be the bathroom break. Maya stood up. Her legs felt shaky as she squeezed past the knees of the people sitting next to her. She walked down the long aisle towards the stage. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her. Or maybe they weren't looking at her, maybe they were looking past her, ignoring her like they had all evening. She felt the weight of the old folder in her hand. It felt heavy, like it held all her dreams and all her fears. She reached the stairs, climbed up slowly, and walked across the wooden floor. The spotlight hit her face, blinding her for a second. She couldn't see the audience anymore, just the black shapes of the room and the large, black grand piano sitting in the center. She sat down on the bench. It was higher than the one she had at home, and she had to stretch her legs a bit to reach the pedals. She adjusted the seat, the metal scraping loudly against the floor. A few people chuckled quietly in the silence. It was an awkward sound. Maya felt her face get hot with embarrassment. She took a deep breath, trying to remember why she loved this. She tried to block out the judges, the bored audience, and the fancy students in the front row. She placed her hands on the keys. They were trembling slightly. To the audience, she looked small and fragile. They saw a girl in a faded dress sitting at a massive instrument. The contrast was almost funny. The energy in the room was low. People were shifting in their seats, checking their phones again. The boy in the sharp suit was whispering something to his friend, probably not paying attention at all. The stage felt vast and lonely. Maya closed her eyes for a brief second. She wasn't here to impress them, she realized. She was here to play. She opened her eyes, fixed her gaze on the music stand, and prepared to play the first note. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming in the ceiling. Everyone was waiting, but not really expecting anything. They were just waiting for it to be over so the next important person could play. Maya sat on the bench, the black leather feeling cool and slippery beneath her legs. She reached out to adjust the music stand, her fingers brushing against the yellowed pages of her sheet music. The paper was soft, almost like fabric, from years of being turned and practiced over. To the audience, this looked like a nervous habit, a stall tactic before a mediocre performance. But for Maya, it was her way of grounding herself. She needed to touch the music before she could play it. The heavy silence in the room pressed against her ears. It was that specific kind of quiet that happens when people are bored, a low-energy hum where you can hear the air conditioning rattling in the vents and people shifting their weight in squeaky chairs. Up in the front row, the atmosphere was completely different. The judges were a trio of severe-looking people dressed in formal clothes. They sat with small notepads on their laps, pens poised. The man in the middle had already checked his watch twice since Maya walked onto the stage. He tapped his pen rhythmically against his clipboard, a clear sign that he was waiting for this to be over so they could get to the real competition. The other students from the fancy school were whispering behind their hands. One girl, dressed in a velvet gown, was rummaging through her purse, clearly not bothering to look up. Why should she? This was just the filler music, the space between the important performances. Maya took a deep breath, filling her lungs all the way down to her stomach. She closed her eyes for just a second, shutting out the bright lights and the rows of faces. She let her hands hover over the keys. They looked small and pale against the massive, glossy black expanse of the grand piano. A few people in the back rows, thinking she was just nervous, let out quiet, sympathetic chuckles. They expected her to fumble. They expected a wrong note in the first measure. They were ready for the awkward pause of a beginner forgetting where they were. But then, her hands dropped. The moment her fingers connected with the ivory keys, the air in the room seemed to change. It wasn't a shy, timid plink that everyone expected. It was a resonant, deep chord that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and up the legs of the chairs. The sound was full and rich, filling every corner of the hall instantly. It was a tone that belonged to a professional, not a shy girl in a second-hand dress. The man tapping his pen froze in mid-air. The woman digging in her purse stopped moving. The sound commanded attention. Without hesitation, Maya flowed into the melody. The piece she was playing was known to be simple, something often played by students who were just learning to express emotion. But under her fingers, it transformed. She wasn't just reading the notes on the page, she was rewriting them. She added a weight to the lower notes that gave the song a heartbeat, a heavy and steady thump that everyone could feel in their chests. The melody wasn't fast or showy, it was slow and deliberate, note shaped like a piece of clay. The reaction rippled through the room like a wave starting from the stage. First, the whispers in the front died out completely. The fancy students, who had been ignoring her, turned their heads one by one. The girl in the velvet gown slowly looked up, her hand still halfway in her bag, her eyes widening in surprise. The judges stopped writing. The man in the middle, who had been checking his watch, slowly put his pen down and leaned forward. His bored expression melted away, replaced by a look of intense focus. He pulled his glasses down his nose slightly to see the stage better. Maya was completely unaware of this shift. She had entered a different world. Her body, which had been tense and hunched over, relaxed. She sat taller, swaying slightly with the rhythm. It was a natural movement, like a tree branch moving in the wind. Her right hand danced along the higher keys, playing the sweet, singing melody, while her left hand provided a foundation that was so strong it felt like the earth itself was humming. What struck the audience wasn't just how well she played the notes. It was the feeling behind them. The previous performers had been technically perfect, playing fast and clean, but it had felt like they were typing on a computer. Maya's playing had a story to tell. It sounded like rain falling on a roof, like a mother humming a lullaby, like the feeling of missing someone you love. It was sad and happy at the same time, a complex mix of emotions that made people hold their breath without realizing it. About a minute into the piece, a door at the very back of the hall opened with a loud creak. A father had stepped out, assuming this was the perfect time for a bathroom break. The noise of the door cut through the quiet. Usually, at a recital, this would be annoying, but it didn't matter. The music coming from the stage was so captivating that the father stopped in the doorway. He didn't leave. He stood there, holding the door handle, listening. He slowly let the door close, stepping back into the shadows of the room so he could hear better. The acoustics of the community center, usually harsh and unforgiving, seemed to be helping her. The piano, a decent instrument but usually played clumsily by students, was singing. Maya was treating the instrument with a respect that it hadn't seen all night. She was coaxing sounds out of it that the other players hadn't even tried to find. Her fingers, which looked so small, were stretching to reach difficult intervals, pressing the keys with a firmness that surprised anyone watching closely. The contrast between how she looked and how she sounded was shocking. The faded dress, the simple hair, the nervous posture, it all seemed like a disguise. As her hands moved faster, crossing over each other in complex patterns, the illusion of the shy student shattered. She looked powerful. There was a grace to her movements that couldn't be taught. It was raw talent, polished by hours of solitary practice in a small living room. In the third row, a mother who had been whispering to her husband about dinner plans stopped mid-sentence. Her mouth stayed slightly open as she watched the stage. She grabbed her husband's arm, squeezing it tight, not to get his attention, but because she was overwhelmed by the music. He looked at her, annoyed at first, but then followed her gaze to the stage. He stopped fidgeting too. The chatter that usually fills these events, the rustling of programs, the coughing, the shifting of feet had vanished completely. The hall was quieter now than it had been all night. It was a heavy, electric silence, the kind that happens when everyone realizes they are witnessing something special. Maya's face was calm, peaceful even. She wasn't smiling, and she wasn't frowning. She looked like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The terrifying crowd, the judges, the pressure, it had all disappeared. There was only the vibration of the strings under her fingers. She hit a series of notes in the lower register, deep and booming, causing the lid of the piano to tremble visibly. The sound washed over the audience like a physical wave. The intermediate label that the announcer had given her now seemed like a bad joke. The difficulty wasn't in the speed of the notes, it was in the control, the touch, and the soulfulness of her playing. As the melody climbed toward a higher pitch, her body leaned forward. Her movements were fluid, like water flowing over rocks. There was no stiffness left in her. The audience was mesmerized. They weren't watching a girl play a piano anymore, they were watching an artist pour her heart out. The people in the back rows stood up, trying to get a better look, craning their necks over the heads of the people in front. They needed to see whose hands were making this sound. When they saw it was still the small girl in the faded dress, the shock was evident on their faces. The piece was building now, heading toward a crescendo. The quiet, gentle beginning was giving way to something stronger and more urgent. Maya's hands were moving with a blur of speed, yet every note was crystal clear. The intensity was rising. The room felt charged with energy. The judges, usually so composed, were sitting on the edge of their seats. They exchanged glances with each other, looks that said, "Do you hear this?" The competition wasn't over yet, but somehow, everyone knew the standard had just been raised. The bar had been set so high that it was going to be very hard for anyone to reach it, let alone pass it. Maya, the overlooked girl in the back row, had just taken control of the entire evening without saying a single word. As the melody moved deeper into the heart of the song, the room seemed to shrink. The walls of the community center, the high ceiling with its flickering lights, and the rows of plastic chairs all disappeared for the people sitting there. There was only the sound coming from the stage. It was no longer just a sequence of notes, it was a living, breathing thing that filled the space. Maya's hands were moving in a way that didn't seem possible for someone who looked so timid. Her right hand was playing the main melody, but it was her left hand that was doing the real work. It was weaving a complex pattern of bass notes and chords that gave the song a heartbeat, a steady and powerful rhythm that thumped in the chests of the audience. The people in the back row, who usually stood near the doors ready to leave, had pressed forward. They were standing now, leaning against the wall, completely forgetting their urge to escape the boredom of a long recital. A young man in a leather jacket, who had probably only come to support a friend, was watching with his mouth slightly open. He looked like he was trying to solve a puzzle, trying to figure out how this small girl was creating such a massive sound. The music had a texture to it. It wasn't just smooth and pretty, it had rough edges and soft whispers. It sounded like a story was being told, a story without words but with very clear meaning. In the center of the room, a little boy who had been squirming in his seat and dropping crackers on the floor went completely still. His mother reached down to brush the crumbs off his lap, but she stopped. She was frozen, her hand hovering in mid-air, listening to the way Maya hit a particular chord. It was a clash of notes that should have sounded wrong, but in the context of the song, it sounded perfect. It sounded like a sudden realization or a sharp intake of breath. The mother looked up at the stage, her eyes wide. She realized this wasn't just practice, this was raw intuition. This girl wasn't thinking about which finger went where, she was feeling the music and letting her fingers follow. The judges, who were usually the most difficult people to please, were abandoning their composure. The woman on the left had taken off her glasses and was rubbing her eyes, perhaps to clear them, or perhaps to hide the fact that they were tearing up. Music can be strange like that. It can hit you in a way you don't expect, bringing up feelings you didn't know you had. The man in the middle had stopped looking at his clipboard entirely. It was resting on his knee, ignored. He was leaning so far forward that he looked like he might fall off his chair. He was a professional who had heard thousands of students play this same song, but he had never heard it like this. He was looking at Maya's hands, studying the way she curved her fingers. It was a master class in control. The contrast between Maya and the stars from the fancy school became painful to watch. Those students were technically brilliant. They could play scales faster than the eye could follow. They never hit a wrong note. But their music was like a perfectly painted wall, smooth, clean, and flat. Maya's music was like a landscape. It had mountains and valleys. It had storms and quiet streams. She wasn't afraid to hold a note a fraction of a second longer than written, or to play a section slightly softer than the sheet music demanded. She was taking risks. She was improvising tiny details that added color. And because she was taking these risks, the audience was on the edge of their seats. They were terrified she might stumble, but they were desperate to see where she would go next. The girl in the velvet gown, the one who had been rummaging in her purse earlier, was now staring at Maya with a look of pure confusion. She looked down at her own hands, then back at Maya. She was realizing that technical perfection isn't the same as art. She saw how Maya's whole body was involved in the playing. It wasn't just her fingers. Her shoulders swayed with the phrase. Her head tilted back when the music climbed high. Her feet moved on the pedals with the grace of a dancer. She was pouring her entire life force into the instrument. It was exhausting just to watch, but it was also beautiful. The velvet girl slowly closed her purse and set it down on the floor. She knew she couldn't follow that. Suddenly, the music shifted gears. The gentle, flowing melody turned into something urgent. Maya's hands began to move faster. The bass notes became deeper, more intense. The sound grew louder, filling the hall until it vibrated against the windows. It felt like a storm was approaching. The audience could feel the pressure building. Maya's face, which had been calm and peaceful, changed. Her eyebrows knit together, and her jaw tightened. She was fighting with the music now, demanding every ounce of sound the piano could give. She played a series of rapid, descending notes that sounded like rain pouring down a tin roof. It was chaotic but controlled, a waterfall of sound that crashed over the audience. In that moment, the shy girl in the second-hand dress was gone. She looked powerful. She looked like a giant. The light from the spotlight caught the beads of sweat on her forehead, but she didn't wipe them away. She didn't wipe her hands on her skirt. She didn't hesitate. Her hands flew across the keyboard, crossing over each other, stretching wide, then coming close together in a flash. The sound was so loud that a child in the front row covered his ears, but he was smiling. It was a thrilling sound, like a roller coaster going downhill. The energy in the room was electric. You could feel the hair on your arms stand up. The judges were now looking at each other, nodding slowly. They didn't need to speak. They knew they were hearing something rare. It is very hard to judge this kind of performance because it breaks the rules. In a normal competition, you look for mistakes. You count the wrong notes. But with Maya, the mistakes didn't matter. Even if she missed a note, the emotion behind it was so strong that it covered the error. The story she was telling was more important than the technical perfection. She was connecting with everyone in the room on a human level. She was playing about sadness and hope, about struggle and joy, things that every person in that hall had experienced. Maya's eyes were closed tight now. She wasn't reading the music anymore. She had memorized it, of course, but she wasn't even thinking about the notes. She was listening. She was hearing the music in her head and letting it flow through her arms. Her left hand played a rhythm that was driving the song forward, pushing it harder and faster. Her right hand was playing a melody that soared above it like a bird. It was a duel between the two hands, a conversation that was getting more and more heated. The audience was holding their breath so tightly that the room felt oxygen deprived. The tempo increased. It was faster than the written music, much faster. Maya was taking a risk that would have gotten her a low score from a strict teacher, but here, it worked. It added excitement. It made the heart race. The fancy students in the front row were watching with their mouths open. They knew how hard it was to play that fast without losing control. They saw her fingers slipping and sliding on the keys, slick with sweat, but they never lost their place. It was a display of physical endurance as much as musical talent. Her arms were pumping, her shoulders rising and falling with the effort. She looked small compared to the piano, but she was dominating it completely. The sound grew to a roar. It was a wall of sound, beautiful and overwhelming. The vibrations from the piano were shaking the floor. A glass of water sitting on the judge's table was rippling. It felt like the music might lift the roof off the building. The audience was no longer bored. They were no longer checking their watches or thinking about dinner. They were transported. They were inside the song with her. They were feeling the urgency and the passion. It was a reminder that music isn't just about sound, it's about emotion. It's about connecting with something deep inside yourself. Just when it seemed like the music couldn't get any louder or any faster, Maya did something unexpected. She hit a massive, crashing chord that silenced the room instantly. It was a sudden stop, like slamming on the brakes of a speeding car. The shock wave hung in the air. The echo bounced off the back wall of the hall and came back to the stage. In that sudden silence, Maya's hands were frozen on the keys. She sat there, panting slightly, her chest heaving. The audience sat frozen too, stunned by the sudden drop in energy. It was the kind of silence that is heavy and full. It was the silence that comes after something profound has been said. No one wanted to be the first to break it. They just wanted to hold on to that moment for a little longer. Maya slowly lifted her hands from the keys, but she didn't move from the bench. She kept her head bowed, collecting herself, preparing for what was to come next. The spell she had cast was strong, but she wasn't finished yet. The silence that followed the crashing chord was heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm breaks. It wasn't an empty silence, it was packed with the energy of the sound that had just filled the room. Dust motes dancing in the spotlight seemed to freeze in mid-air. Maya sat with her hands hovering over the keys, her chest rising and falling visibly. She wasn't posing for dramatic effect, like the other students might have done. She was genuinely catching her breath. The physical effort of pouring so much force into the instrument had taken a toll on her small frame. A single bead of sweat rolled down her temple and hung from her chin, but she didn't wipe it away. She was too focused, too deep inside the music to notice anything as small as perspiration. Then, just as the audience began to wonder if the piece was over, her hands moved again. But this time, they didn't strike. They caressed the keys. The transition was shocking. One moment the room was shaking with thunder, and the next, it was filled with a whisper. Maya began to play the second movement of her arrangement, a section that was usually treated as a boring bridge by most students. Under her fingers, however, it became a secret conversation. The sound was so soft that people in the back row leaned forward in their seats, straining their ears. It was a daring move. In a big hall, playing quietly is much harder than playing loudly. If you play a wrong note loudly, it sounds like a mistake. If you play quietly, every tiny hesitation or slip of the finger is exposed. But Maya didn't hesitate. Her touch was feather-light, but the notes rang out with a clarity that was bell-like. It was like she was tiptoeing across the keys, afraid to wake something up, yet unable to resist the beauty of the melody. In the front row, the judges were completely transfixed. The man in the middle, who had been so stern just 10 minutes ago, had taken off his glasses entirely. He was holding them loosely in one hand, his index finger tapping gently against his leg in time with the music. He wasn't judging anymore. He was listening. He realized that this girl wasn't trying to show off how fast she could play. She was trying to communicate something. She was using the piano to speak a language that words couldn't express. The simple, intermediate label on the program sheet was now a cruel joke. The complexity wasn't in the difficulty of the notes, but in the sensitivity with which she played them. The atmosphere in the hall had shifted completely. The boredom was gone, replaced by a collective sense of intimacy. Even though there were hundreds of people in the room, it felt like Maya was playing for each person individually. An elderly man near the aisle, who had come to watch his granddaughter, closed his eyes. A small smile played on his lips. The music reminded him of something, perhaps a memory from his childhood, or a feeling he hadn't felt in years. That was the magic of what Maya was doing. She wasn't just playing a song, she was unlocking emotions in the people who listened. The contrast with the previous performers was stark. When the conservatory students played, they looked at their hands, making sure every finger was in the perfect position. They played for the judges. But Maya played for the music itself. Her eyes were closed again, her head tilted slightly to the right. She was swaying, not because she had been taught to move, but because the music was moving her. It was a natural, human reaction. Her body was an extension of the instrument. The faded dress, the simple ponytail, the old folder, none of it mattered anymore. The costume had fallen away, and only the artist remained. Suddenly, the melody began to climb again. It was a slow, steady rise, like a sapling growing toward the sun. Maya's left hand started to add more weight to the bass notes, building a foundation again. The intensity began to return, but it was different this time. It wasn't aggressive like before, it was triumphant. It felt like the main character of a movie overcoming a great obstacle. The audience could feel the story arc. They were on a journey with her. A young girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, was standing on her chair near the back. Her mother tried to gently pull her down, but the child resisted, her eyes locked on Maya. The little girl wasn't interested in the fancy dresses or the trophies. She was captivated by the look of pure joy on Maya's face. For the first time that night, the performer looked like she was having fun. She looked free. And that look on her face was more inspiring than any perfect score could ever be. As the music grew stronger, Maya's hands moved with increasing confidence. She started to take liberties with the rhythm, slowing down here and speeding up there, shaping the phrases like a sculptor molds clay. This is something that only a master musician can do. If a student does it, it sounds like a mistake. When Maya did it, it sounded like inspiration. She was bending the rules of the music to fit her feelings, and it worked perfectly. The fancy students from the front row were now watching with a mix of awe and envy. They realized that all the lessons in the world couldn't teach what Maya had inside her. They had perfected the technique, but she had the soul. The girl in the velvet gown was no longer looking at her friends. She was watching Maya's hands, trying to understand how she made the piano sing like that. It was a humbling moment for them. They saw that talent isn't about how much money you spend on lessons, it's about how much heart you put into the work. The sound was swelling now, filling the room once more. The vibrations from the piano were so strong that you could feel them in the wooden floorboards. Maya was playing with her whole body now. Her shoulders moved back and forth, her feet worked the pedals like she was driving a car, her head bobbed with the rhythm. She was covered in sweat, her hair sticking to her forehead, but she didn't care. She was in the final stretch now. She was giving everything she had left. The judges had completely abandoned their scorecards. The woman on the left had her hand over her heart. The man in the middle was just shaking his head slowly, a look of disbelief on his face. They knew they were witnessing a once-in-a-lifetime performance. This was the kind of thing people talk about for years. Did you see that girl at the recital, the one in the simple dress? It was a moment that transcended the competition. It didn't matter who won the trophy anymore. Everyone in the room knew who the real winner was. Maya's fingers were flying now. The notes were cascading down, tumbling over one another in a rush of sound. It was chaotic but beautiful, like a flock of birds taking flight. She was pushing the tempo, playing faster than the written music, but she never lost control. It was a tightrope walk without a net, and she was dancing across it with a smile on her face. The audience was gripping the armrests of their chairs. They were scared she would fall, make a mistake, crash into a wrong note. But she didn't. She was fearless. The energy in the room was at a fever pitch. The air felt charged, like the static electricity before a lightning strike. Every person in the hall was connected by the sound. The barriers that usually separate people, the rich parents, the poor students, the bored judges, the nervous siblings, all melted away. They were one entity, united by the music pouring out of this small, overlooked girl. Maya could feel the energy too. It fed her. She played harder, pouring her own hopes, her own struggles, and her own dreams into the final bars. She wasn't just playing for tonight. She was playing for every time she had been ignored, every time she had felt small, every time someone had looked down on her because of her clothes or her background. And now, in this moment, she was huge. Her voice was the loudest in the world. She began the final approach to the end of the song. The chords became wider, stretching her hands to their limit. The sound became massive, filling every corner of the hall, bouncing off the ceiling, shaking the windows. It was a wall of triumph. Maya's face was lifted towards the lights, her eyes squeezed shut, a look of pure ecstasy on her face. She was riding the wave, soaring higher and higher, taking the entire audience with her. The end was coming, and everyone knew it. They could feel it in the way the music tensed up, like a coiled spring ready to snap. They held their breath, waiting for the release, waiting for the final crash that would seal the moment in history. Maya raised her hands high above the keyboard, pausing for the fraction of a second to let the anticipation build, before bringing them down for the grand finale. Maya's hands came down on the final chord with a force that seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical wave that hit the audience in the chest. Boom! The note hung in the air, suspended by the sheer power of her strike, vibrating through the floorboards and up the legs of the chairs. Then, her foot lifted off the sustain pedal, and the sound was cut off into absolute silence. For 3 long seconds, nobody moved. It was the kind of silence that is deafening. The air in the hall felt heavy, charged with the electricity of what they had just witnessed. No one breathed. No one coughed. No one shifted in their seats. 300 people were frozen, staring at the small girl sitting at the massive piano. Maya's hands were still resting on the keys, her shoulders heaving as she gasped for air. She was staring straight ahead, her eyes seeing nothing, her mind still trapped in the world of the music. The dust motes dancing in the stage lights seemed to settle, waiting just like the people. Then, from the very back of the room, a sound broke the spell. It was the sharp, loud clap of a single pair of hands. It was the father who had stood in the doorway earlier, the one who had come back in to listen. His clap rang out like a gunshot in the quiet. Almost instantly, the room erupted. It wasn't a polite, slow ripple of applause. It was a sudden, explosive roar. The noise started at the back and swept forward like a tidal wave, crashing over the stage. The effect on Maya was instant. She jumped slightly, as if waking up from a deep sleep. The spell broke, and her face flushed a deep, bright red. She blinked rapidly, adjusting to the reality of the bright lights and the wall of sound coming from the audience. She pulled her hands back from the keys as if they had suddenly become hot. She looked out at the crowd, but her eyes were wide with shock, not arrogance. She looked terrified. The audience was on its feet. The judges stood up immediately, which was something that almost never happened at this competition. The woman who had been covering her heart was now wiping tears from her eyes with a handkerchief, clapping enthusiastically. The man in the middle was beaming, a genuine, ear-to-ear smile that transformed his stern face. The fancy students from the conservatory were standing too. The girl in the velvet gown wasn't rummaging in her purse anymore, she was clapping hard, looking at Maya with a mixture of awe and respect. She knew she had been outplayed. Maya stood up slowly. Her legs felt like jelly, and she wobbled a bit as she found her balance. She gave a small, awkward bow. It wasn't a graceful, theatrical bow like the ones practiced by the other students. It was a quick, nervous nod of the head. She looked like she wanted to run away and hide. But the applause only got louder. It swelled, filling the hall, bouncing off the walls. People were cheering, shouting bravo. And amazing. As she turned to walk off the stage, the applause followed her. It was a sound of affirmation, a validation of everything she had worked for in that small living room with the beat-up piano. As she walked down the steps at the side of the stage, her knees were shaking so much that she had to hold the handrail. She walked past the heavy curtains and into the dark wings of the stage. As soon as she was out of the spotlight, she leaned against the wall and covered her face with her hands, taking deep, ragged breaths. Her heart was pounding so hard it hurt. When she finally walked back into the auditorium to return to her seat near the back, the atmosphere had completely changed. The path cleared for her like she was royalty. People stopped her to pat her on the back or shake her hand. An elderly man squeezed her shoulder and whispered, "That was beautiful, sweetheart." A young mother gave her a thumbs up. The kids who had been whispering and laughing before were now staring at her with open mouths. She wasn't the invisible girl in the faded dress anymore. She was the girl who had made the piano sing. She sat down in her plastic chair, shrinking into herself slightly, trying to become invisible again, but it was impossible. The energy in the room was now centered on her. The rest of the recital felt like an anticlimax. The next performer walked onto the stage, a very talented boy who played a difficult Mozart piece. He played perfectly, without a single mistake. But to the audience, it felt flat. It felt mechanical. After the storm of emotion that Maya had brought, perfection felt boring. People checked their phones again. They whispered to each other, not about the boy playing, but about Maya. "Did you see her hands? How long has she been playing? I've never heard anything like that." When the recital finally ended, the judges huddled together for a long time. Usually, the decision for the winners was quick and easy. It was almost always given to the student from the conservatory who played the hardest piece. But this time, there was a debate. They looked at their scorecards, then they looked toward the back of the room where Maya was sitting with her parents. Finally, the master of ceremonies walked back to the microphone. He cleared his throat, looking a bit nervous himself. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice booming through the speakers. "We have reached the announcement of the grand prize." He paused for effect. This year, the judges had a very difficult decision. There was a performance that exceeded our expectations in every way. It reminded us why we love music. He opened the envelope. "The winner of the grand prize is Maya." The applause that broke out was even louder than before, if that was possible. Maya's parents gasped. Her mother covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes filling with tears. Her father, a quiet man who usually kept his feelings hidden, let out a loud shout of joy. Maya sat there for a moment, frozen. She looked around to see if there was another Maya, maybe someone sitting behind her. But everyone was looking at her. She stood up and walked down the aisle toward the stage. This time, she didn't look at the floor. She walked with her head up. The spotlight hit her, and she didn't shrink away. She climbed the steps and walked to the center of the stage where the judges were standing. The head judge, the man who had been so stern at the beginning, handed her a large trophy. It was gold and shiny, heavier than it looked. "Thank you," Maya whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise of the crowd. The judge smiled at her. "No," he said softly, so only the microphone picked it up. "Thank you." She stood there for a moment, holding the trophy against her chest. She looked out at the sea of faces. She saw the fancy students clapping for her. She saw the little girl standing on her chair, cheering. She saw the father who had stayed to listen, giving her a nod of respect. The feeling that washed over her wasn't pride. It was relief. It was the feeling of finally being seen. She had walked into this room feeling small, feeling like she didn't belong because of her dress or her background. But she left knowing that none of that mattered. What mattered was what was inside her, the thing she couldn't buy at a store and couldn't learn from a textbook. Maya walked off the stage, clutching her trophy. As she reached the back of the room, her parents enveloped her in a hug. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. Her mother just held her tight, and her father ruffled her hair, messing up her ponytail completely. They walked out of the community center into the cool night air. The parking lot was quiet compared to the hall. The stars were shining above. As they walked to their car, Maya looked back at the building one last time. The lights were dimming, and the people were dispersing. She knew that tomorrow, she would go back to her old life. She would go back to school, and she would still have to wear the hand-me-downs. She would still have the old piano at home. But something inside her had changed forever. She knew now that she had a voice, and that when she used it, people would listen. She wasn't just the girl at the back of the room anymore. She was a musician. And as she got into the car, she smiled, a real, genuine smile that lit up the night.